Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode we're continuing on with more on our A+ series, actually continuing our conversation on different internet connection types. A lot of fun there, and joining us in the studio for those revelries, our good friend Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, welcome back, sir. How's it going?
Man, it's going good. Good to be back here again because I certainly talked a lot in the first one, that's for sure. And
you're bumping your gums.
Oh, absolutely. And the first thing I want to kind of talk about, just a little quick little recap on what we talked about in the first part. Remember, we were kind of letting you know what you could expect behind the scenes when it comes to the internet. I was telling Dan this before we started. You know, I remember coming out of A+ thinking that this internet service provider, right? There's one person out there, right? And they're providing service to everybody, and I've got to have access to the backbone of the internet, only to learn that, well, it's really divided up in a hierarchy and that there are different connection types, right? We talked about the difference between circuit switching and packet switching. Briefly mentioned cell switching. You'll definitely learn more of that if you get into Net Plus. And then we talked about, well, if we can look here at the diagram, remember we talked about the three primary, or three of these, I guess you would say circuit switching type communications that are really a digital to analog signal. Remember, dial-up, ISDN, and DSL. All right, and if any of these don't sound familiar to you, ladies and gentlemen out there, go ahead and go back to the first part here, and then we'll see you back in part two here. Now, moving on, we got to talk about another type of connection, internet connection out there, and that is fiber. And sometimes you can see today, you can see fiber inside of your, connected straight to your home. For the longest time, the fiber optic communications have been something that's really just seen in the ISP. So, for instance, here, Sonnet that we have on our screen. It's the synchronous optical networking, if you will, and that's what it's called here in the States by the American National Standards Institute. They're the ones that oversee the standard, if you will. In our European countries out there, we have what's known as the International Telecommunications Union, and what they call it is the synchronous digital hierarchy, all right? So, again, kind of synonymous terms there when it comes to our digital or fiber optic communications. But Dan, like I said, for a long time, this is the only place yet we would really find this is, well, really just inside of your ISPs. Why? Well, let's go ahead and kind of go back to briefly a topic that we talked about when we were talking about media types in another episode, right? We had mentioned single mode fiber and multi-mode fiber. If you guys aren't aware of the specifics, definitely go back and check that out. But keep in mind, it really comes down to the overall distances on, which fiber mode you choose and how they transmit the communications across the cabling. All right, now, when we look at internet connection types, right, we're talking about primarily, you're talking about single mode communications just because of the long transmission distances. Remember that one of the big differences between multi-mode fiber and the single mode fiber is really the transmission, or the length, I should say, of the cable and its potential for high amounts of bandwidth. Your single mode fibers could reach cabling distances up to 40 kilometers on a single cable. That's 40,000 meters. It's a pretty good stretch when you consider without having to use repeaters, right? And a repeater is nothing more than something that receives a signal. Doesn't matter if it's electromagnetic energy through a copper-based media or it's an optical light source through a fiber optic media. It regenerates the signal and it allows it to extend that signal or that transmission across the full length of an additional form of whatever your media is, whether it's copper based or whether it's fiber optic based. So that's one of the reasons you see that single mode cabling a lot of times is, we have some of in our server closets as well. So don't let me confuse you when you have what's known as the demarcation point. And that's probably something we should just briefly mention here when we talk about internet connections, right? Because we have the ISP side, your carrier, the telecommunications provider, right? Their network, you're not required to service. You shouldn't have access to legally. Where that comes into your network and makes a connection to your network, that's called the demarc or the demarcation point. It really divides up the point of responsibility, right? To the telco's provider side, they're responsible for that network. If a cable's dug up, they're the ones that have to come out and fix it. However, on your business or residential side of the demarcation point, anything that happens on that side, you're digging in your, or knocking a wall down, in a building, and you cut the wire, that's going to be you that is responsible for it. So I don't want you to think that we don't have single mode fiber inside of our networks here, within, on that side of the demarcation point, but primarily because of the transmission distances, single mode is what's going to be used by your ISPs. Now, again, I mentioned a little bit about Sonnet, right? If we can go back to our diagram here, I do want to just kind of talk about what kind of topology you're seeing here, more of the specifics. Again, we'll get into inside of Net Plus. Keep in mind that Sonnet is a very high-speed networking. We're talking past 10 gigabit per second. And again, because the larger bandwidth, it gives the ability for the ISPs to take multitudes of these cables, aggregate them together, and just we're talking terabits of data, which is mind-boggling, right? In its capacity to send information across of it. Sonnet is also a dual ring topology. It's one of the great things about it in the fact that you have a primary and you have a secondary ring, and that allows for a self-healing fault tolerance. Fault tolerance, remember, is a way that we can I guess essentially continue to function when there is a foreseeable failure that happens, right? If we have two of something, one fails, the other one can take up where the last one left off. And that's what you see in your synchronous digital or synchronous optical networking. Keep in mind, it is a fiber optic based communication. Now, the other thing that you're also seeing in fiber optic communications is things like Fios. I think Verizon has Fios, and that's a residential based fiber optics that can give you a potential for a great amount of speed. Google was another one here in Gainesville. Gosh, I want to say it's about 6 years ago. They did a survey to see if people would be on board with gigabit speeds. Again, sustained gigabit speeds over fiber optic communications for whatever reason, whatever bureaucracy or legality, it didn't happen. And it's definitely in other cities too, where Google's literally becoming the ISP and bringing fiber optic communications right to your residence. And again, Verizon has things like Fios, again, which is a fiber optic service that they're providing too. At this point, as of May, I want to say, or June of 2017, here's a little asterisk, the fine print is that you really have to check your community, your neighborhood, right, your region, to see if it's something that is available. Typically, fiber optic communications are going to be expensive, right? You're going to have an expense. It's going to be a lot more expense over a copper-based media. Copper-based media, copper-based devices, they're typically less expensive than their fiber optic counterparts. However, there's also pros and cons, right? You talk about ISDN, you talk about DSL, you talk about cable TV, even dial-up, you're talking about a copper-based communication. They're susceptible to things like electromagnetic interference, which also reduces the quality of the feed, the quality of the communication as well, and it reduces the price point too. However, fiber optic media, again, it's counter, the counter to that is the fact that it isn't susceptible to electromagnetic interference, and it can give you a lot more bandwidth, a lot more speed, potential for better performance, if you will, in the long run, but it usually comes at a significant price point.
So you're saying if it's available and you have the means, it's definitely the way to fly.
Oh, most definitely, especially if you're a gamer. I mean, gamers want every bit of the bandwidth they can get, so maybe not something you would lay inside your house, right? Multi-mode fiber, just because of the fact that it is so darn expensive, or can be for sure. It's definitely coming down in price over the years.
Up in availability.
It really is. We showed you in our fiber optic communication, or I'm sorry, in our one of our PC connection episodes, we kind of looked at a fiber optic cable that one of our other hosts cut, right? Well, about 10 years ago, you wouldn't have thought about cutting that cable just as the sheer price point. But again, the price point's coming down, so it's something that you're going to see more and more of, I predict, as the future goes on. And I don't really think that I'm psychic by any means or have any kind of ESP going on. It's just one of those telltale signs that as they bring the price point down in any technology, it becomes more available to the public, becomes more feasible and economical for people to have and bring inside of their houses. All right. But we've been talking a lot about bounded media. This is the other thing, bounded connections, when we talk about an internet connection type, and really when you talk about any kind of connection type, remember there are two primary types. There's bounded media through some kind of physical cable that has to make a physical connection between endpoints. Doesn't matter if it's copper-based medium, which is the most prevalent, or fiber optic communications, there is a physical connection. You also have some of these connections that are unbounded media, right? They're using some form of radiated energy that allows allows for the communication. And like we've mentioned in other episodes, remember that sometimes there are limitations in being able to lay physical cables, right? Maybe it might be just location, 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 as they say, right? It might be the fact that maybe you work in a location that has some kind of historical significance, and it's actually controlled by your local county, right? And if I'm working at a historical site, I can't necessarily go in, even if I own the place or if I manage the place, and start knocking down walls, right? That might not be feasible. So radiated energy and unbounded media, wireless type communications, we're getting to the point here, do have their place, and they're really, really common today, especially when we talk about ease of installation. We don't have to worry about, hey, what kind of cable do I have? What are the links that I have to run? Do I really want to get in the attic, get the fiberglass all over me? Do I want to get under the house?
That's
for
an
sure?
easy question to answer. No.
No, that's right. Dan and I joke sometimes that's the reason we got into IT in the first place, right?
You've
to
been
get out
in
of
Florida
the
in the
construction.
summer, not fun.
That's right. A lot of cold showers after
Yeah.
laying cables and fiberglass, you know. So that's one of the benefits, right? One of the benefits to wireless communications is we don't really have to worry about that. But again, wireless communications aren't without their drawbacks as well. Right, with a wireless communication, yes, sure you don't have to worry about limitations of the cables themselves, but you also have to worry about radio frequency interference. Right now we have obstacles, because just because we don't have the ability to lay the cables and now we have a wireless communication, that wall still might present a problem. You know, because you still can't knock it down, but again, the radiated energy might not make it through those locations as well. Now, that's in your local networks. Keep in mind there are also unbounded communications. We talk about mobile phones. We talk about cellular communications that we have to keep in mind as well. So there are some that we want to mention here when it comes to internet connection types, right? First one I think of is satellite. Got a little picture here, and again, you guys maybe have seen, guys and gals out there have seen satellite before. We use satellite almost on a daily basis, whether you realize it or not, right? If you've got a GPS system in your phone, you're using satellite, whether you knew it or not, right? The global positioning system is an example of a satellite communication that sometimes we take for granted as being satellite. It was former military as a way essentially to triangulate 3 or more of the satellites that are in orbit, if you will, to focus on, pinpoint your position, hence the term global positioning system. There are 24 of these satellites that are in operation 365 days a year. There are 3 that are on standby on backup just in case one fails. The other one can take over, right? So you're using a satellite communication, whether you have an internet connection or not, anytime you use a mobile device that has some kind of GPS system.
Just a fun fact, I actually used to deliver these satellites to NASA so that they could launch them into the sky. From Boeing. We'd pick them up from Boeing, where they were manufactured, and then bring them to either Cape Canaveral or Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Very fun. It was very cool. And to know that I kind of had a hand in the fact that we get to use GPS was kind of neat for me.
You know, by daytime here, Dan is definitely one of the best hosts we have at IT Pro TV. By night, he is Neil Armstrong. So that's amazing. That is great. That's really cool to be able to do that, to go into a place like that. So you can see we're using satellite communications at sometimes when we don't even realize it. And again, like I said, that's regardless whether you have internet service provider or not. However, with satellite communications, keep in mind that you can have a satellite internet connection type. There are some pros and cons to that as well, right? It's a radiated energy, just like Wi-Fi that you have in your home networks. Let's talk about the benefit first. We don't always have to be so pessimistic here, right? Let's talk about the benefits again, all right? It is another one of those ones where it isn't feasible in areas to lay physical cabling. I don't care if it's fiber optic media. A lot of times your ISPs aren't really going to, might not be running copper-based media just because of some of the general limitations, so they typically will lay fiber optic communications, but that might be expensive, right? I know that we've got one of our hosts that lives in an area that, you know, for lack of a better word, is really in the middle of a pasture, right? It's Cowtown, right? There's a lot of farms out there and stuff, a lot of space, and ISPs just can't justify spending the cost to bring 5 people in the whole city some kind of internet connection. So he has to use satellite, right? And that's where you get the benefit. The fact that we have a direct line of sight communication. We've talked about that before. I do want to briefly mention that, you know, most wireless is an LOS communication, which means you need some kind of line of sight between the transceiver and the receiver, if you will, or the transmitter, excuse me. I say transceiver. Transceiver is what the chips that are in your network adapters, and I say that because they transmit and receive, but the transmitter and the receiver, right? Satellite, this line of sight communication is the curvature of the Earth. So it is the farthest, the longest line of sight communication that we have on the planet today. And in fact, obviously, we're using things like the Hubble satellite, right? That can go however many millions of miles out there in space and can show us, just interstellar space, right? Keep in mind, there's a drawback too, right? With that extreme geographical distance, yes, we get the benefit, but we also get latency, right? There's tendency for it to be fairly delayed and a limited amount of bandwidth, which means bandwidth, again, is the theoretical capacity of a communication channel to send information. How much could I send, if I was to send communications over that wire? So for instance, we got a cup of coffee here. If you look, the full cup, that would be its bandwidth. That would be its capacity, right? How much I've actually have in the cup, right? That's what's known as throughput. When we say throughput, that's what's actually happening. So how much coffee I have in the cup versus how much it can hold would be the difference between bandwidth and throughput. Keep in mind that your bandwidth is really limited when it comes to satellite. And then we throw in some of the other concepts that we've talked about when it comes to satellite. We talk about radio frequency interference, reflective, we have refraction and reflection, if you will. You have bounce when it comes to the signals themselves, can further slow it down even more. So satellite might not be something that you want to ensure high definition video is going across, right? You might get very, very poor performance out of that. Data files could be great, right? It's not a time sensitive type communication. I'm okay with that. It might take a little bit longer, right? But if I want to have a high definition conference system and Dan and I want to communicate, it's probably going to be better that happens over an ISP that's using fiber versus one that's using satellite communications. All right, so that's one of the very first ones that we talk about. The other one's cellular communications, right? You're probably familiar. It's a rare day and age that we live in today that most people don't have some type of cellular communication, right? Very, very prevalent, and I want you to know some of the technologies that you could see. Now, in the Net Plus, please understand, ladies and gentlemen, we go way more in depth in the specifics of these technologies, but there are some cellular communications that we want you to know about there. Two of the main ones that have been around for a very long time are CDMA, Code Divisional Multiple Access, as well as GSM. GSM is Global Systems for Mobiles. We talk about global system mobiles. Again, this is one where it's easier to swap your phones. And why is that? Well, if you look at GSM, GSM is one of the cellular communication types that uses the little SIM chip, right? And that SIM chip kind of looks like a little SD card, and I can pop the SIM out. I can buy me another phone and then pop the SIM in that new card, and it switches. The carrier says, oh, okay, well, all your information's in that card anyways. Now I see the phone, and relative to the device information and your account, we can go ahead and use that phone now. CDMA, the Code Divisional Multiple Access, a little bit different, right? This is the one where you get a phone lock, and I don't mean a phone lock as in like a PIN number that you have, a PIN that you have to put in. I mean the phones are typically only going to go through that carrier. Like your turn and burn phones that we have, the ones that you buy, you pay a monthly price, and then when you're done, you kind of throw them in the garbage. These can be SIMs as well. But again, with CDMA, you do get carrier locked because the phones themselves typically will not be able to be transferred between carriers. A couple more that we're going to talk about as well when we talk about our LAN types. WiMAX is another one. WiMAX has kind of gone by the wayside today because of LTE. LTE is the long-term evolution. You've probably heard of it. This is the 4G technology. WiMAX was a very early on 4G technology. The company the body that oversees it's called the 3GPP, and they said, okay, you can call WiMAX 4G technology, but it's a metropolitan area-based network, and it provides a high bandwidth. Think of it as like Wi-Fi for an entire city, if you will, right? It's a wireless interoperability for microwave access.
It's actually really cool.
It is, right? It's got a pretty decent bandwidth. It's got like 30 megabit transfer speed. So, I mean, it's not really a slow. I do want you to know an IEEE number on this. When we talk about things like Ethernet and Wi-Fi, right? We've mentioned Ethernet is an 802.3 standard. Wi-Fi is 802.11. I want you to know 802.16. I don't know if they're going to ask you that on the exam, but technically that's the IEEE specification for WiMAX. And again, it's a metropolitan area-based network, which is a network type we're going to talk about at the end of this episode. Some of the other ones that we can talk about, we've talked about 3G. That's a generic term. 4G, that's a generic term. The most dominant 4G technology today is called long-term evolution, right? And that's LTE. So you don't have to know the specifics and the individual bandwidths, I would say, in the A+, but know some of your different cellular communication types. They might ask you on the exam, and we don't know exactly what's going to be on the exam. We definitely have a list of objectives, and we try to make you as prepared as possible for that exam so you knock it out of the ballpark. They might ask you, they might say, which of these is a cellular communication? They might put ISDN in there, right? They might put cable in there. And then somewhere in the list, they might put something like LTE. So just be aware of what the connection types are. All right, Dan, I'm sure I've probably forgot one. It looks like we've got satellite cellular. Now, we do have to talk about some of the concepts around cellular communications, and this is more about configuration than it is modification of the communications itself, right? Cellular and satellite are two specifically different types of communications. We're really talking about some of the configurations you can do with cellular today, and that is what's known as tethering and a mobile hotspot. All right. Conceptually, they're almost kind of like the same,
yeah.
right?
Very close.
Yeah, absolutely. So tethering essentially is a way to allow multiple cellular communications over a single device. And a mobile hotspot is technically multiple cellular communications over a single device. So what's going on here, right? Well, with tethering, that means I have something like, my cell phone, as I struggle to find it in my pocket here.
I stole it.
Yeah, he stole it, that's right. So I have my cell phone, and what I do here is I let Dan says, hey, I need to get a connection right now. And I know Dan's got cellular communication, but let's say that he brought in, like, for instance, an iPad, right? And if I had an iPhone or here, right, or an Android tablet, I said, you know what, Dan, that's okay. I know we're on the road, but let me go ahead and open up tethering, and you can connect right to my phone and use my connection to get out there to the internet, right? That's tethering. Now, with mobile hotspots, this is a little bit different. This is typically some kind of dedicated device. In fact, I stole Dan's credit card right here before the beginning of the show, and we're going to spend his money, right? Let's go ahead and check this out. I brought up a little search engine here, a Google, a little search engine, massive search engine, and we just typed in mobile hotspot device, and you can see that there are these little devices. They're all different kinds, guys. We're not endorsing anybody here. You can see that you can get some of them at Best Buy. You can get them on Amazon. There's Netgear out there, all different kinds. And I tell you what, we'll take this Best Buy one and kind of view what this is. It doesn't really look like much, doesn't look like anything special. But what it is a device that allows you to do something known as multiplexing, right? It's one of the things that you get in internet connections when we tell you that you multiplex, you're taking more than one signal. And you're sending it out over a single channel, a single communication. And that's essentially what this allows you to do. It allows me that if I don't have a cellular communication, let's say Dan and I both have Android tablets or iPads, and we need to connect out to the internet, but we don't want to pay the price monthly, if you will, for a single cellular communication across each device. Well, that's okay. We can buy one of these devices, or the company can, IT Pro TV can, and they have in the past, right? We've taken this to things like when they went out to the, the cyber security conferences as well. The RSA, thank you, and the Consumer Electronics show or whatever, CES. Right? Well, we had a bunch of devices that weren't phones, but they needed some kind of internet connectivity so that we could stream that information live, right? Well, we would get one of these mobile hotspots, and we'd allow each one of those devices to connect to the singular device, if you will, and make those communications.
Quick point of clarification, just to make sure you guys understand exactly the difference between tethering and hotspotting. Tethering is when you actually use a USB cable to connect your phone to another device and use that phone's connection to give it internet access. Hotspotting is when I'm using Wi-Fi or wireless communications to do basically the exact same thing. The cool thing about hotspotting, though, is I can add multiple devices a whole lot easier than I can with tethering.
Right, right. All right, so notice that it really doesn't look much different than any other connectivity device you have. So which device you buy really is based on the plan, and look at the quality. Some devices, again, will say, hey, we offer this kind of speed. We don't offer this kind of speed, right? So again, just like everything out on the internet, how much money do you have to spend? They also talk about line-of-sight wireless internet service. That's another completely different topic here. When we talk about line-of-sight wireless service, WiMAX. WiMAX is an example of a line-of-sight internet service. Cellular communications are a form of line of sight. You get within a cell that a tower, is producing, and you've got to have some kind of communication with the tower. WiMAX uses different transmitters as well, so also keep that in mind. Again, line of sight internet service. You might hear the term LOS, wireless internet service. And again, it just means that whatever the transmitter is, I have to be within the line of sight so that the receiver can pick up that information. All right. Now, one of the last things I want to mention are the geographical locations. We've kind of mentioned some of these terms, all right? They call out a few of them. I always say these are the ANs, right? We have what's known as a WAN, and we have what's known as a LAN, all right? A WAN is a wide area network, all right? A LAN is a local area network, all right? So I've got kind of a little diagram that describes what a LAN is. A local area network essentially is a network that's comprised of a single geographical location, and it's under the control of a single administrative body. All right, well, what do we mean by that, right? Well, it could be a business, it could be a residential area. Your home network is considered a local area network. It is typically connected with a relatively high-speed, short-range media, all right, and it is sitting typically behind your home router or modem, if you will, but you control it. You dictate how many computers or devices in there. You control the cabling and all that, even if you have somebody come in and do the wiring. All right, a wide area network is comprised of multiple geographical locations, if you will, all connected together, right? WANs, wide area networks, are typically something that you're going to see inside of a corporation or a business, right? Where maybe Dan works at our eastern branch, right? Our eastern branch might be here in Gainesville, right? I might say, okay, hey, Dan, I'm moving to New England, somewhere up in, I don't know, maybe in Massachusetts or New Hampshire there, and we have a local area network up there. But over the internet, we are connected to where if Dan needed resources within my LAN, he can gain access to them. If I needed access to the resources within inside his LAN, we could through the WAN connection. Really, when you look at it, guys and gals out there, the internet is nothing more than a bunch of local area networks, and they could be very big local area networks connected together, forming a wide area network. They call out a couple other ones there as well. They call out what is known as a MAN and a PAN. All right, now when we talk about a MAN, we're not talking about gender here. We're talking about a metropolitan area-based network. We've talked about one MAN-based technology, metropolitan area-based network. That's WiMAX, right? Because what does it do? A metropolitan area-based network, you can think of it as, I used to say zip code, but technically that's not true. Think of it as more like a city, right? A city basically type connection, right? It's a geographical location that isn't quite as big as a WAN, certainly much bigger than a LAN itself. All right, last one is the PAN. That's the personal area network, and a personal area network is typically just a couple of computers, maybe your laptop and your home computer, if you will, maybe your cell phone. You could take, for instance, I know people like the Bluetooth earbuds. Bluetooth will allow you to form a personal area network communication, right? Bluetooth is an example of a device or a technology that allows you to form a wireless personal area network communication. It'll be a little more specific.
You can do through tethering as well.
That's exactly it. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Tethering and mobile hotspots almost will perform the personal area network. So just some of the different kinds that you have out there. There are some kinds that are additional ones that they don't call out in the objectives, and just for honorable mentions, we'll go ahead and mention them here. CAN is another one. That's a campus area network.
Canadian area network.
That's Canadian area network. That's right. Campus area network is typically under the control of a single academic body. We'll give you an example here. We're in Gainesville. We have UF. UF has buildings all over Gainesville, all over the Alachua County area, right? right? And they control every one of them. And their connections in between that building, they might very well have laid them. Now, they can also rent them from an ISP as well, but they control that network themselves, right? You can have things like doctors' offices, insurance companies can be considered, well, I guess that's a little bit different because it's not academia, but you know, things like Berkeley, if you will, where there's large buildings, if you will, all over the place, and they form a single campus area network. Global area network, I'm glad I see this one gone because it is very confusing when you say global area network versus a wide area network, because that was one of those gray areas, like, because technically the internet could be called a WAN and a GAN, as they call it, a global area network. Global area network typically is one that you have like a wide area network that spans multiple countries, right? Versus just a single or multiple geographical locations within a single country. So a couple other ones that we want to mention there. Thank goodness you don't have to worry about that on the exam. I will say, know the difference between a PAN and a WPAN as well, because there's a personal area network that uses wired connections, and there's a wireless personal area network connection, like Dan mentioned, with tethering and hotspots, if you will, and the Bluetooth communications there. I forgot about it there for a second.
Escaping your mind.
That's right, and that's
I love that.
and that's why you got to keep it in mind there. So you don't want to do that on the exam, because that would be bad. So just a couple of the different kind of internet connection types that you got to be aware of for the exam.
All right, Wes, they were definitely a multitude of them. So go back through these things, understand which connection type is what follows under what category, and how they're actually working. Just be familiar with those things. It's not a super in-depth look at these topics, but you do have to have those basic familiarizations. That being said, Wes, it looks like we've come to the end of yet another great episode. Hopefully you feel that way, and we'll come back for more, because we got more A+ coming. But let's go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.